Well, hello everyone. Welcome to this panel today on balancing economic development and environmental sustainability. As you can see in the panel list, Mr. Suman Sinha was supposed to be here, but unfortunately he had to cancel at the last minute because he got sick. But today we have, I'm happy to introduce our moderator, Mr. Anish Sugatan.
Hi.
He is a postdoctoral fellow here at the Harvard Kennedy School at the Sustainability Science Program. We also have Professor Ragini Pandey and Ambassador Pradeep Kapoor. I now turn it over to Mr. Anish to introduce the panel, and we really look forward to a lively discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shweta. A very good afternoon and welcome all of you to this panel discussion on the challenges of balancing economic growth with environmental sustainability, and the focus shall be on India. So it's a pleasure and it's a great delight to be sitting here with esteemed panelists. The way we have structured this talk is that for the first 30 minutes or so, we'll be talking to the panelists in a conversation, interactive, and then we'll open up the panel to questions from the audience, again for another 30 minutes or so, and then we'll wrap it up. So we have here Ambassador Pradeep Kapoor and Professor Rohini Pandey, and each one of them is uniquely qualified to talk on this topic, and each of them brings in a diverse set of expertise and experience to bear upon this subject. Ambassador Kapoor is a former Indian ambassador who was among the first in his batch to serve as India's ambassador to the Kingdom of Cambodia and the Republic of Chile. He was also the founder president of International Conference on Connecting World Heritage Sites and Civilizations. He is currently the visiting clinical professor of International Trade, Development and Security Issues at the School of Public Policy, University of Maryland in Washington, D.C. He's also involved with the team in India that's setting India's commitment to climate change or the upcoming Paris conference, INDCs, which is coming up in late this year. Welcome, Ambassador Kapoor. Professor Rohini Pandey is an economist and the Muhammad Kamal Professor of Public Policy at Harvard Kennedy School. She's the area chair of the Political and Economic Development in Harvard. She also co-directs the Evidence for Policy Design initiative. Her research interest examines economic costs and benefits of informal and formal institutions and the role of public policy in effecting change. She also examines how low-cost improvements in collection and dissemination of information can enable flexible regulations and lead to more efficient outcomes in areas as diverse as environmental protection, as well as including things like electoral outcomes. So welcome both of you. To set the ball rolling, I'll pose a very fundamental question at the heart of this topic itself. That is, whenever we are talking about this question of economic development versus environmental sustainability, it is posed as a zero-sum game. Some kind of a hard trade-off had to be made between these two. The question is, is it really hard kind of a trade-off when you're talking about in general and specifically for India? How bad is this trade-off, and how could we approach this problem? Probably.
Well, thank you very much, Anish. We have been talking about climate change for quite a few years now, and earlier the stakeholders were mostly the scientists. Then it shifted a little bit of ground and technologists also got involved. Then you had a lot of the bureaucrats getting actively involved in these discussions. Then the governments became players and stakeholders. After that, the civil society got into the act. The international body, the UN and other organizations became very active, the UNFCCC, which we have all heard of. So the sands have been shifting globally over time in the decades. And I, as a diplomat representing India's interests abroad, was asked over many years of the last decade or so, not before that, it was not such an important burning topic before that. It's only in the last few years that it has acquired this very big persona, very big dimension. To represent India's point of view. Now, so I will just dwell very quickly upon what was our position, what is our position, what will be our position, and what should be our position globally. So, when we were asked to, we were sent big briefs from the central government that this is our position and this is how we justify it. So, to me as a diplomat, it seemed that I had to argue a case which was saying that our position is that first, the developed countries of the world have contributed very significantly in destroying the environment, the atmosphere, the resources of the world, and it is now our turn to do the same. And we have a full right and justification to destroy what is given to us by nature. It was not very easily defensible, but that seemed, in a nutshell, putting it in a sort of a format of growth, economic development, and sustainability, and that we had a right to, get our people out of poverty, get the masses, raise their standard of living, their quality of life. So economic development was essential. So there were a whole lot of arguments linked to this whole thing. But we were conveying our right for development by having an increasing share in carbon emissions. And the world also, the viewpoint of the world was very similarly inward looking for most of the countries. So the climate change negotiations which started globally seemed to be heading nowhere. Because everybody was saying their own thing and nobody was listening. Everybody was just talking. And then came this phase where the coastal countries, the island nation states, they were faced with real disasters. That any small rise in temperatures would mean significant rises in the water levels, which would mean that the nations would literally become history. They wouldn't exist any longer. And they formed a group of activists within this community to raise these voices. So even coastal countries, Holland, etc., which in French and in their own language already means Netherlands or the Pays Basque, the lower country. All these would face very disastrous consequences. It's not that India wouldn't. India would also be facing many disastrous consequences. The US already, we have seen how it has gone through so many very significant mega catastrophes just in the last few years, a large number of which are easily attributable to climate change. So the argument was going on in that fashion, and to me it seemed like a very hopeless situation, which was getting into a black hole and into a spiral where it would go downward and downward and downward. And it would be very difficult to retrieve the situation, because with big players like China and India acting as spoilers, as the developed world called it, no climate change negotiations anywhere in the world would be making any progress. Now suddenly over the last year or so, I see a very refreshing change. The whole dialogue has changed, the whole conversation has changed. How this has changed, why this has changed, if we dwell upon it a little bit, we'll understand why there is a lot of cause for hope and optimism now. So instead of saying that these are the targets, this is Kyoto Protocol, this is what is expected of your country, this is what you shall do, this is what you shall be accountable for, this is what you shall report upon. So all those arguments were put on one side. Instead of the conversation taking place in very isolated, esoteric atmospheres between different stakeholder groups, in New York last year, in September during the General Assembly, for the first time, all the stakeholders were put in the same room. Which were the stakeholders? What I mentioned earlier, the scientists, the bureaucrats, the technologists, the political leaders, the civil societies, the NGOs, the international organizations, and who else? The main contributors to pollution or climate change, the industrialists, the business people. So which had never happened before. Now once you put all of them together in the same room, and then you say, okay, this is the problem. Now what we are expecting of you is to think of what you can do in this sphere. Not that what we are asking you to do or what we are expecting you to do. So the whole dimensions changed completely. And from what was a top-down approach suddenly became a sort of a contributory, cooperative, collaborative approach. And the term which was used a little bit earlier than that was intended INDC. I don't know how many of you here have, probably many of you have read about it because we have so many experts in the room. But INDCs were like intended nationally determined contributions. Not fixed, not written in stone, intended. Not internationally imposed, but nationally determined contributions. So now the Lima conference took place a short while back. The Paris conference is expected to take place end of this year. So all the countries are working on these INDCs now. There is still a lot of gray areas, a lot of problem areas. The CBDRs, which are all very important words and jargon also in many ways to many people, are important aspects. There are still areas of disagreement. These will continue. CBDRs are the common but differentiated responsibilities where, the richer nations are expected to contribute more towards the green fund because of the historical responsibilities. And the percentage change in temperature rise in the world is sought to be kept to less than 2% because anything about 2% will prove to be very disastrous. So this in a nutshell paints the broad strokes of the climate change discussion and where we are today. In India, we have had a very strange and very interesting phenomena where I saw a lot of my colleagues in the bureaucracy very actively championing the cause of India's development against the concept of green. Now, I had worked as ambassador of India in Cambodia, for example, and there this is a personal story which I'd like to narrate here very briefly. We have these great monuments of the world, which are some of the biggest monuments in the world, called the Angkor Wat monuments. And in one particular monument, for example, in many other monuments it's the same problem, but in one particular one, there are these huge trees which are growing on the monument structures. If you click onto Cambodian temples or monuments, you'll find thousands of images pasted all over the net of the trees growing on the walls, on the parapets, on the structure of the shrine, on the main shrine. Huge trees with the roots spreading across the length of a building, maybe, like this building itself, Kennedy School, on all sides. The roots visible partly outside, not visible outside. Now, when you have these huge mammoth trees, this I'm just explaining as a aspect of the growth versus green model. Now, the theory by the archaeologists, by the conservators, by the people who are supposed to restore these monuments was that the stone is immortal, the tree is mortal, the stone has to be preserved, the tree will die, so why not let it die earlier to preserve the monument? Why? Because tourism was the mainstay of the economy. So development was taking place in Cambodia because of the increasing number of tourists which were coming in to see these monuments. And to preserve the monuments, the trees had to be destroyed. Now, I, as an ambassador who was, fond of the environment, I'd go to these monuments, I'd see these beautiful trees. I'd realize that what 1,000 years back, these trees all date back to about 1,000 years. They are from 9th century BC to about 15th century BC mostly, but there are many monuments which are earlier than that also. I realized that a lot of the attraction of the monuments today, the beauty, is because of the trees and not in spite of the trees. And the moment you remove the trees, half the beauty is gone. So I wrote a book also about changing the theory of conservation and restoration of monuments, whereby I argued that we have to let the trees remain and we have to indulge in a process called anastolysis, where we list out all the stones, we number them, we record them, so that once the tree falls down due to its natural process of growth and death, then we restore that monument by knowing where the stone goes exactly because of its prior numbering. So that has fortunately been accepted today, and that is helping increase the tourism significantly. So the argument should not be growth versus green, in my opinion. It is growth and green together. So there are a lot of areas where we can see that the more focus you have on having green along with growth, the long-term interests are automatically looked after. Here, before I just stop. So the bureaucrats' attitude had to be sort of little bit slowly adjusted. So Modi government came along with a lot of new ideas, new thoughts. They've done a lot. We'll get into those aspects later. But one point which I want to say here at this point right in the beginning is that even if we go back to the ancient times, there was a lot of green growth. It was not growth versus green. It was a lot of green growth. So if we look at the Prithvi Sukta of the Atharva Veda, it has a very beautiful ode to the earth. So just to set the tone for the discussion, I'll just read out a few lines. It's a big message to the world, which was written thousands of years back, which is relevant today, and which will probably be even more relevant tomorrow. This is ode to the earth. May this earth, replete with the seas, with rivers and water sources, excellent food grain from agriculture, prolific vegetation, and abundant living creators bestow upon us munificent nutrition. May the earth, who is in the nature of a mother, hold us, her children, close to her life-endowing self, protect us, and may Parjanya, the rain-bearing clouds, in the nature of a father, tend our upbringing. May this earth, so charged with positive force, neutralize that element which impels ill will or aggressive intention or subjugation of human beings and their elimination. May the earth give us, her progeny, the capacity to speak pleasantly with each other. May our languages enable harmonious interaction between ourselves. In daily life on earth, wherever we are, whether we are sitting, standing, or in motion, may our activity be such as would never cause injury or grief. I evoke the earth which gives shelter to all the searchers of truth, to those who are tolerant and have understanding, to all things strength-giving, nutritious, the source of creative spirit. We depend on you, O earth. O earth, in the villages, in the forests, in the assemblies, in the committees, and in the other places on earth, may what we express always be in accord with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kapoor. That's a very inspiring ode to set tone to this conversation. Yes, please.
Yeah. So I just wanted to pick up on this theme of green versus growth, and I think in some ways probably I have a less optimistic view of where we are heading right now. I think there is a basic fact that we have to recognize, which is growth across the world, economic growth across the world has tended to rely on increasing use of energy. So to the extent that India sees itself as poised for another decade or 2 decades of high industrial growth and high economic growth, it is very likely going to increase energy usage a lot. Given that it's going to increase energy usage a lot, and it plans to do that largely through a large expansion of coal-fired power plants. It's talking about investment in renewables, but I think a lot of what's going to happen in the short to medium run is going to be a lot of expansion in coal-fired power plants. So that's the context in which I think it's reasonable to project that irrespective of what negotiations happen, we are going to see India, which is right now sort of the third largest greenhouse gas emissions in the world, becoming significantly more important. So given that, I think the question is, why should India care at all about being green? One view could come that it comes from international climate change negotiations. India decides it wants to be a responsible international player, and it enters and sets the tone. And I hope very much, as you said, that in Paris this year we'll see some of it. But the other argument which I want to push, and I think has not yet got as much traction in India as I think it really should, is that what's happening to air and water in India right now makes it very much an extremely important public health problem. So I and some colleagues, including Anish, just published some work arguing that the levels of air pollution in India right now means that the average Indian citizen is losing up to 3 years of life. And I think exactly building, for instance, on the ode you're talking about, I think we'd all agree economic growth is not very valuable if there aren't people to enjoy it. But more seriously, I think once you start seeing these levels of pollution, you also start seeing labor productivity being very directly affected. So it's no longer a case that you're thinking of a trade-off between economic growth and emissions, but there's very clearly you're reaching points where growth itself will be affected. I think the one slightly positive trend I do see is there seems to be increasing public awareness. So there seems to be increasing public awareness in the last year or so of the levels of air and water pollution we are seeing. I think the short-run response, ironically, will probably be very much from the international community. So you hear discussions of, diplomatic commissions saying that they're going to reduce the length of postings of their officials. And that's the sense in which I think in China, the reason why China has turned, and the reason why in some sense India and China no longer share the same platform when it comes to talking about climate change, is because of what has happened to air pollution in China. I think China recognizes that one of the places where it faces the most citizen unrest, one of the places where it sees a lot of investor unhappiness about coming and sending people to live in China, has come from the domestic air pollution issue. So I think what I would push is that yes, growth typically will require more energy. If we think purely in terms of emissions, India is going to go that route.
Right.
If India is going to, in some sense, undertake a number of actions which will have climate co-benefits, is going to come because it addresses its air pollution problem. But for that to happen, I think we need a really significant increase in sort of public awareness and activism, and that hopefully is what we should aim for in the next year or two.
That's a very interesting reversal of stance. Instead of co-benefits of climate, you're talking about rather than health co-benefits, you're talking that by reducing pollution, you have direct health benefits and then climate co-benefits. That's the way India should put forth its stance. Interesting. Taking a cue from that, I'll ask. Let's go to the more domestic kind of scenario, especially the current government and its stance on climate change and economic policies. We all know that the current government, led by Prime Minister Narendra Modi, came to the power with a huge popular mandate on accelerating economic growth. Now, given that context, do you feel that there is a general sense of antagonism against climate change, or rather environmental concerns, as if though environmental concerns are an impediment to rapid growth? Do you see that, or do you see that changing?
Bureaucracy all over the world is known for, by definition, not moving very fast. So there is naturally going to be a, not very fast change in this also. There is a lot of incentive, there's a lot of requirement, as you have said, about the quality of life, about the average age of life being reduced. All these are very important factors, and I guess they will be very compelling aspects. Now, there are certain areas on which there has been a very significant divergence of opinion between the views propagated by the bureaucracy and what Modi tried to impart as his imprint. I remember, for example, in one of his speeches, he mentioned that, no Indian mother or father will consume what rightfully belongs to his children or his grandchildren. Also, we find that while we are still talking about coal-fired plants, and large number of licenses are being given for coal-fired plants, but there is also a very great movement taking place within India in the field of renewable energy. Just 2 weeks back, or maybe less than 2 weeks back, there was this very big conference in Delhi called Reinvest. Reinvest was not reinvest as in invest, but renewable energy invest. Now there were stakeholders from all over the world who came at this conference, and for the first time I found, as a person who's been working in the system for 35 years and I'm no longer part of the system now, that there were certain very pragmatic initiatives which were taken, which were very, diametrically different from what had been done earlier. There were commitments. Firstly, there was discussion made by the Prime Minister Modi and by his team that we have to have a paradigm shift. We are no longer talking in megawatts for renewable energy. We are talking in gigawatts. Secondly, he said that we have commitments of 100 gigawatts of renewable energy in the next 5 years. That is mainly from solar and wind power. Thirdly, there were people who were lined up, who gave letters of commitment in front of all the participants, in front of all the cameras, the TV, the media, the social media, pledging that they would be contributing 5,000 megawatts or $1 billion or 10,000 megawatts or 7,000 megawatts, which totaled up to more than 100 gigawatts already in the next 5 years. Now these are all going to be game changers. There are little initiatives which have started. We saw in the earlier session about these green cities and these smart cities. So all these are going to be contributing and are already resulting in a very significant change in the way of thinking. So the bureaucrats, whether they want it or not, either they'll have to lead from the front or they will be led. And it's already happening. And with the industry also coming in with their pledges, with the civic society and the civil society very active, with the NGOs active, with a lot of awareness through what all of the smart young people in this room also contribute through the various new media, the social media. That is going to create a dynamic, in my opinion, a world dynamic in favor of this sort of change, which is very essential for the future of the world, for the world to prosper in a greener way. And it's not that we have not thought green. We have been, as a civilization, I just want to bring forth the point again, as a civilization we have had the capacity to think of solutions for our people which have lasted for thousands of years, 4,000, 5,000 years. What are these examples? One simple example, yoga. Now, how many civilizations in the world have been able to contribute thought or idea or concept to the world which has lasted for 1,000 years or 2,000 years? Even the clothes we are wearing today, these are maybe 100 years old, maybe just a little more than 100 years, maybe 200 years old, but not more than that. Which are the other ideas contributed by other civilizations which have lasted for thousands of years? Hardly any, very few. But you see, this civilization in terms of its green thinking, you had so many aspects which were contributed to the world, and in terms of human existence itself. You have the yoga, for example, the dress form, the sari, you talk about it in the Mahabharata and Draupadi. You have the festivals of India, the Holi being talked about as Krishna's favorite festival, Diwali, spices. So there are so many things which have continuity, and the cooler, etc. All these are non-plastic, they are all biodegradable, not polluting elements. So we have to start rethinking also from that point of view to see how to make it a better relationship between human being and the earth and nature, to make development, to create development in a harmonious sort of way, not in a very way which harms the mankind itself.
Thanks. Let me pick up on that. So I'm going to pick up on the hope of renewable energy that you put forward for India. And let me start with the caveat that I think pretty much any policy to some extent does only as well as it's implemented. I think in India we've seen this in many areas. You could think about education, you can think about healthcare, where we've thought about some of the, the most exciting policies, but then had a very hard time sometimes thinking about implementation. And my big fear with thinking about renewable energy as being the big solution or the big answer to India's problem is that we're heading potentially in the same direction. So one of the big issues with renewable energy that we know across the world is storage. Renewable energy is very hard to store. Now, yes, things like the price of the solar photovoltaic has fallen, but not by a huge amount. In a country like India, where we already have a lot of problems when we think about electricity distribution, when we think about a grid that's not very functional, to think seriously about renewable energy as a contributor, we have to think very seriously about both rehauling, how your regulatory regime works, and also how renewable energy will come into the grid and move out of the grid. This is something that we are seeing European countries struggling hugely with. So in a country like Spain that has, say, 20% wind power at this point, it's been a huge issue of how to manage their electricity markets. So I think it's very hopeful to talk about renewable energy, but I think we can't afford to let that get ahead of a lot of the places where I think right now are the big bottlenecks. One of the big bottlenecks we have is how electricity generation and transmission works. And I think probably to me the most promising thing that has happened with the new government is the removal of some of the subsidies on fuels. I mean, in the end, when you're subsidizing fuels, you are subsidizing the use of coal, and you're subsidizing increasing emissions. The concern is that I think we haven't, as a country, moved away from thinking about a lot of promises of free electricity. I think just in the most recent election, we've seen that come back, for instance, in Delhi. And I think if you have a system where you're going to continue to have free electricity, putting huge amounts of pressure on distribution companies for electricity, no matter how many commitments we get from renewable energy, it will not affect the mainstream. So I think what I would say that if we want to think seriously about renewable energy, much as I love the talent of all the people in this room, and I spend a lot of time with many of the people in this room, I think the big challenge is to take on not just regulatory challenges, but to take on how do you actually get electricity companies, transmission systems that are going to work, and to recognize that renewable energy is a challenge everywhere. So my fear is that we would actually sort of put forward this promise of saying, yes, we're going to go after renewable energy, but like many other things, the slip between these commitments and these promises and actually what happens is large. So I think what we need to do is a lot more seriously think about how is this actually going to integrate with the system, and there I think right now I've seen less.
Okay. Well, if I may just...
Yes, please.
Well, of course, I appreciate that, there is always a lot of possibilities of slippages, and there's quite a slip between the cup and the lip. But about the renewable energy, solar energy, for example, there are studies which show that India has more than 70% more solar energy impacting on India as compared to Germany. But the conversion of solar energy in Germany is that much more higher. Now, the efficiency of utilization of solar energy will be that much more, and with scalability will come affordability and reduction in cost. There's also all the stakeholders were involved in that conference, Reinvest conference, renewable energy. The banks, the financial institutions, the international bodies. So they talked about contributing initially about this hedge fund for scaling this slight difference now, which is there between fossil fuel and renewable energy. So this will also help in scaling it to higher levels and reducing the cost further. The other aspect which I want to say is that the number of inventions which are taking place in front of our eyes on a day-to-day basis with startups all over the world is so phenomenal that I feel that the aspect of storage, which is a great issue today, will not be such an issue very soon. Because if you can think of just the whole world as a village, as they say, Vasudev Kutumbakam, you have solar energy impacting upon one part of the world and not impacting upon the other at the same time. And if you have an international grid, not just a national one, the time when there is solar energy in one part of the world can be utilized in the dark part and vice versa. So some such solutions may arise not in the far too distant future. The problems will also be there. Definitely, you have talked about Delhi, you have talked about all these subsidies, free power. Well, India is a country of problems. India has been a country of problems. India will continue to be a country of problems. When I look at India, in perspective, I am very proud, I am very happy that in spite of having a population which is like 50, 60 or 70 countries put together, we are still very comfortable with trying to find solutions for those problems. If we put together the whole of North America continent, South America continent, Central America, Caribbean, the population of all these countries is just about 700 million and India is more than 1200 million. Similarly, we put all of Europe together, still much less than India. All of Africa together, all the 54 countries, still far less than India. So if you can imagine the problems that exist in Latin America, or just Africa, or just any of these grouping of countries, and you see Indian population being, more than 50, 60 countries put together, the problems are going to be there. But what we are, very proud of is as a nation, we are moving ahead, we are trying to reduce poverty, we are trying to tackle these problems. The intensity of the problems will always be there, but it's not something that we always try to put under the carpet or at any time put under the carpet. We have to tackle these problems. It's just that there is this issue, for example, the CBDRs. So with greater collaboration and cooperation and the global platform through the social media, through the new media, through the global media, it becomes easier to share best practices, to have exchanges of information and knowledge. And India, in the traditional construct, has also been a very great contributor of the global GDP. I came across this very interesting chart very recently, which I would have put up on the slide, but I'll just mention it to you. This was by The Economist magazine and the IMF and the Angus Madison research of the last 2000 years of the global economy. In this chart, they have shown India as having more than 1/3 part of the global economy for the first 1000 years. For the next 500 years, it is shown as having more than 25% of the global economy. For the next 200 years, it is contributing more than 20% of the global economy. For the next 200 years, Britain is shown as contributing a significant percentage of the global economy when it was a colonial ruler of India. So for 1700 out of the 2000 years, India is contributing more than 20%, 25%, 30%, 33% of the global GDP for 1700 years. And for 1900 years, that's 200 years of the British economy included, it is a significant player in the global economy. If the British economy, the Indian economy is taken as a subset. So here in the whole article, it mentions about China being earlier one of the bigger players, world's biggest in purchasing power parity problems, US being the next biggest player, UK being for a short time one of the bigger players. There is not a single word about India. But in the graph which is given below, if you just look at the graph, the total domination in 2000 years of world history, of the economy of the world history, is the contribution by India. And this is not by some bright young Indian kids out of Harvard or MIT who have put together this chart. This is by The Economist, by the IMF, by Angus Madison. So I envisage a sort of evolution in the future where we will have to become the global leaders and not spoilers even in this game of climate change. So that's where I expect some of the bright minds in this hall also to start focusing upon as to how to get India into that position where we are trendsetters and we are not being told by the world that this is what we have to do, but we are showing to the world that what the world should be doing.
I'm happy. I'm also glad about the glorious past of India, and I'm also optimistic about the future of India. but we have a serious problem at present in facing. So I'll probably focus rather sharply on that problem that we're facing right now. Of, let's say, domestic air pollution, for instance. And one of the landmark, it's not yet landmark, but one of the big overhauls that the present government was trying to do was the rehauling all the 6 big green laws of India. And there was a committee set up, the TSR committee, which came up with some recommendations. I would like to take some of your views, Rohini, because you came up with this paper on the impact of pollution in India, and you also had a couple of recommendations. I'd like to take your view on how progressive are these recommendations of the committee, and are there concerns? Of course, there are concerns in the media, but what's your take?
So I think the fact that you have to sort of think about how to redesign the regulatory framework, I think, is very welcome. And I think in that sense, the government is exactly right in saying that we need to think about some reforms. I think what's interesting to recognize is where a lot of the push for this reform was not coming from the fact that pollution is very high, that the Ganga has not got clean despite many committees.
Right.
The push for the reform was coming from this big fear that environmental clearances have recreated the license Raj for India. I think the big issue that the way people talked about sort of the environmental regulatory regime correctly was that it takes up to 2 or 3 years, and we've looked at some data, to get a very long period of time to get clearances. Since industrial licensing was ended in the early 1990s, if you talk to any industrialist in India, they'll tell you that the main headache they face in starting a new plant is going to be the environmental clearance. There's a famous case of POSCO, the Korean company, trying to bring in the largest single FDI to India, which was endlessly delayed on environmental clearance. So while I think there is a huge need for regulatory reform, I don't think the regulatory reform was pushed ahead because of this recognition that we need to do something about pollution or climate change. It was also, it's said that what we need to do is we need to understand how to reduce the bottlenecks. I think the second is extremely important, needs to be addressed, but I think that may have become a little bit the focus of the reforms. So if I was to put on the table a couple of things that I think one would hope to see come forward as the TSR committee report goes through the subcommittee for the parliament and then comes forward, I think one of the big issues that India faces right now is the legal structure within which any kind of environmental concerns like pollution are taken up. So right now in India, all pollution misdemeanors or not being in compliance with the law are a criminal offense.
Right.
In a system where the judicial system does not work very well, where you have a lot of problems with the courts, what this implies is that if you file a case, it'll go on forever. And so pollution control boards and other regulators correctly undertake action only for very severe misperformance. It also obviously leaves open a lot of room for inspectors to have a lot of power because they actually hold the gun of criminal charges over your head. So one thing that we have seen happen across the world, and I hope very much India will take this on as part of its reforms, to introduce the notion of civil penalties. Once you introduce the idea that you can have civil penalties for pollution, it also allows the possibility to move towards market mechanisms to deal with pollution. So right now India has a very traditional command and control mechanism
right.
of addressing environmental issues. I think the world over we've seen a lot of success in moving towards market mechanisms, and certainly market mechanisms like cap and trade systems are increasingly central to dealing with environmental issues. So I think that would be my second hope. That said, I should say one thing. I know I've sounded like the naysayer in the room. So I should say that I think it is interesting that India has moved forward on coal tax. But I think what would be incorrect is to take all taxes that have climate co-benefits and call them as climate taxes, as I think this time's Indian Economic Survey tried to do.
Right.
I think certainly India has done well in having coal taxes. It's just announced that it'll double it to pay for some of its renewable energy investments. So I think that's all very positive. But I think that's not going to be enough. I think we need a regulatory regime in which we have market penalties. We have civil penalties, and we allow for market systems. So that would be my big hope of what might come forward as the TSR committee report goes forward.
As we are heading towards our hard stop at 5, I'll quickly wrap up with one quick question to Ambassador Kapoor. There has been a radical shift in India's stance as far as climate change is concerned. Over the past, few months, things have changed, and in between Obama visit happened, and there was a U.S.-India climate deal. Now, there seems to be some kind of a, this shift is driven by international pressure, even though Prime Minister Modi has declined that there is any pressure. But from the statements made, I'll just quote Prakash Javadekar. In September, he says that when we are asking about cuts, he says, what cuts? That's for more developed countries. The moral principle of historic responsibility cannot be washed away. India's first task is eradication of poverty, and it would be at least 30 years before we'll start talking about declining emissions. But recently, last month, after Obama visit, he says, we have already started walking the talk. Let me tell you very clearly that business as usual will not be there as far as our action on climate change is concerned. So do you think that international pressure on this front is really making the government bring about changes, not only on a rhetoric level, but it has a potential to bring in real domestic changes?
Well, that's a good point you have made, Anish. Now, international pressure in positive areas is always good. And I'm glad that there is a lot of international pressure on all the governments. We have seen the drastic change which took place in the position of China on this issue of climate change, because they also realized at some stage that it is in their long-term national interests. So I guess for us also, it's the earlier we realize that it's in our long-term national interests, whether we attribute it to internal decision-making processes or international pressure or whatever. The sum and substance of it is that we have to realize where we are heading and where the world is heading, and what is the right way to head there. Now, by first granting, all this coal-fired plants licenses, and then realizing that these have a lifespan of 30 years and that it's already too late in the day, and these are some very important areas where we need to focus upon right now rather than later. And the more pressure that is brought to bear upon the policymakers, upon the decision makers in these aspects, not only by the international community, I would say by our own young people, the better it will be for our future generations. So that's my take on that.
Thank you so much. So we had a lot of interesting conversation. In fact, a few agreements and a lot of disagreements. But I think now it's time for us to open up the panel for questions from the audience. I'll just okay. I have a really short memory. So yeah, I'll start with the first hand going up there.
Hi, my name is.
Can I be the second person so I can get them the mic?
Absolutely.
Hi, my name is Azam Thatte from GE Research. I have very particular interest in this discussion because I'm leading a large U.S. Department of Energy program on developing a disruptive renewable energy technology through GE. GE has vested interest in developing these technologies for India. One question I have is what steps government is taking proactively to meet the grid parity level required to make this sustainable. U.S. Department of Energy launched an initiative called Sunshot on the basis of Moonshot for sending man on moon to get the cost of electricity, levelized cost of electricity down to 6 cents per kilowatt hour by 2020, down from 21 cents per kilowatt hour just a few years back. And they have already reaped all the low-hanging fruits. So what you're saying, the scaling would get the cost down. That only helps for the low-hanging fruits. The major innovation that needs to happen to get it from, say, 11 cents per kilowatt hour to 6 cents per kilowatt hour is a major technological development that needs to happen.
The question.
And is government doing any policy changes in terms of subsidy or taxation benefits to make the power plant operators who work on this technology make it sustainable for LCOE?
Let's take a few questions.
Few questions, that's fine. Yeah. We have a question there and a question there.
Sure. Hi, thank you so much for the presentation, and I greatly appreciate you talking about tradition. Is this the right time to look back at the ancient wisdom that we have in terms of our traditional water management systems as a low-hanging fruit that we can really avail, and we can use innovation to create a hybrid system? Is this the right time, and what will it take for the country to realize the untapped potential? Thank you.
Government of India recently announced the National Solar Mission. Seems very promising, stretch goals. Just wanted Rohini ji's views on the NSM.
Right. So we have one over here and one question over here. Right. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you. So one of the things which I understand with this discussion is, we can have grand plans, but the reality in the ground is it's going to take a lot of time to really get renewable energy, green energy, very effective in place of the conventional energy we have. So, and I come from a place where there's a coal mining, and the situation is really, really bad with compared to the air pollution. There's an open cast. People are living in that area. And I'm like, well, this is the government who is doing it, and it is completely ignoring this fact that it is the lives of the people who are at risk. So I don't think they can wait for 50 years for the renewable energy to be effective. So I would like to know, what is it the government can do in 5 to 10 years' time to make the lives of the people much better?
And we have one question over there.
Hi, my name is Angad. I'm a Dartmouth undergrad. My question is directed towards you, Professor Rohini. And I know this discussion sort of revolved around a very macro level perspective, but something like growth and the environment is also a very individual, personal consideration that citizens need to make. We saw that the Delhi elections, despite Delhi being one of the most polluted sort of cities in the world, had sort of zero political talk or sort of campaign talk about pollution, neither from the citizens nor from the politicians. So how do you think that political sort of incentives can align to bring the environment as something that is a campaign issue?
Good. So, right. So, yeah. So,
take some and then I can jump to you.
Sure.
So thank you. Those were all great comments. So I sort of see them as falling in 3 buckets that I'd answer. So one is sort of, what will it take for us to have a lot of innovation on renewable energies, I think especially in the big things, which will bring down the cost of storage, essentially. The second is, while that's going on, what can we do to deal with a lot of the immediate harms, say, from coal mining? And that, I think, links to this question of what do you do about pollution, especially, I think, in large urban cities. So I think in the first, I don't think the challenge India faces is any different from that being faced in the US or anywhere else. I think it needs a lot of R&D investment, but I think it also needs us to be quite clear-eyed about whether or not this will happen. So one of the, I think, choices that India needs to think about, and probably people are a lot, is the right choice to put all your sort of eggs in the solar basket versus thinking about something like wind. I think wind we've seen a lot of problems in Europe with, so solar, given where India is probably better. But then what does it mean in terms of R&D investment? Some of the choices, interestingly, do tend to be regulatory. So, and I think, Anish, you may know more about this than I do. India early on did make a choice in terms of its import taxes on the type of photovoltaic cells it would allow in, which turned out to actually be a wrong choice in the long run. So I think one of the things that I think India needs to be willing to do is to be very nimble-footed in how it's going to deal with also domestic imports, because a lot of the innovations that are happening on these cells are happening outside. They can be scaled up in India, but we need to make the right tax choices of when they come in and scale up. And I think that requires us to be very nimble-footed in how we allow things to come in from foreign sources and then go out. I think one of India's big strengths, which I think you mentioned in some sense, people across the river always talk about, and you'll hear a lot about tomorrow, is sort of the jugaad economy of India and what it's good at. I think for it to actually be therefore the place that does the solar innovations, we need to not have these constraints on which technologies are being innovated with. So I think that's where sort of thinking about export-import policies and innovation and R&D will interact. I totally hear you, and I think this is something we have been working a lot on, this question of, to me, the low-hanging fruit is just having regulation that works on standards that as a country we have accepted. So if you look at what standards exist, India may be slightly weaker than standards in, say, the US, Europe, but not by much. But we know we are grossly non-compliant with it, and there are certainly hotspots in areas like where coal mining is. So one issue that Anish and I have thought about quite a lot is India has moved very much to this view that it is cheaper to have power being produced where the coal mines are, rather than transporting coal and having power generation somewhere else. What this means is that you're basically creating hotspots in the 10% of India's districts that have coal mines. So I think one serious thing that India has to think about is, are we going to start thinking about the carrying capacity of districts purely from a health perspective, in terms of how much are you going to place your power generation exactly where the coal is, and how much are you going to actually go for, say, green fields or go further afield. And so I think that sort of links a little bit with yours, is that I think we need just more public knowledge and discussion of these issues. I think in Delhi, to a large extent, I think this was not an issue because there's very little public awareness. I spend January in Delhi every year, and until even last year, I used to sort of be the naysayer when people would say, oh, it's very foggy today. And he said, no, it's not fog, this is smog. And I think what has changed is small things. Is when you look at the weather forecast now, like on Google or something else, it actually says smoke. Rather than, I think, literally till last year it used to say fog. I think these things can make a big difference. I think just the fact that this time before the election, I think 3 days before, NDTV, Barkha did a show on pollution. I know her well. This was not something she was talking about last year. So in that sense, I'm more optimistic. I think one of the big things we'll need to take on is vehicular transportation, which we haven't had a chance to discuss. I think that's a contributor to emissions. But that's, for cities, that's the big issue. I think Shanghai, Beijing, these guys have all recognized the need. We have to restrict the number that cars come on. That requires things like thinking about taxing cars. I think India has not yet sort of been able to have that conversation. So, and then I'll end and hand over. I think, as economists, we often say the choice is between sort of mitigation and adaptation. And I think the fear is that we spend too much time sort of believing we're going to have this renewable energy source, while what I think we need to think a lot more about is things like diesel cars on the road, or just, as you said, sort of current day coal. And I think both should happen, but we shouldn't forget the second.
Thank you, Rohini. Well, there are, all sorts of pollutants and pollutions. The vehicular pollution you've talked about, the noise pollution, the water pollution, the heat pollution, the waste heat pollution. So there are very serious issues. At one time, I remember cars were seen as very great gifts to mankind. Time may come when they may be seen absolutely the opposite. Already they are not being viewed very positively. So definitely a lot more emphasis will have to be given on walk to work, on urban public systems of transportation with very high car taxes, etc. So those sort of solutions will have to be found. The other area which I want to address, which has been raised by some of the people who have put forward these questions, one aspect is technology. Now, when I was working, for example, in Chile, they developed a system of solar heating and solar panels, which is quite cost effective, which almost reduces the price from 11 cents to about 8 cents. They use different technologies. They don't use glass, they use plastic. They don't use metal. So it's anti-theft, anti-breakage, greater sort of life for the structure, much greater efficiency. Heating is much more efficient. So there are all these technologies which will have to come into play in a very significant way, which will add to lowering the cost. The other aspect which also needs to be addressed is about the subsidy. Subsidy is not a good formula. It has not been generally speaking in the past also. It will be even worse in the future. So what you have to think of is solutions like a little more support or some hedge funds established by Exim banks, by the commercial banks, which will support this sort of investment in the short term and make it more easily scalable and affordable and bring down the cost significantly in the nearer term rather than in the longer term. The aspect of using the solar panels on riverbeds, for example, so that you're not even using a lot of land in a land-starved area or land-starved areas of the world. Those sort of solutions will also have to be found. The other aspect which can be given a thought to very soon, very easily, is India has passed this law about all corporations devoting 2% of their total profits on CSR. Now, if a part of that is dedicated to this field, R&D in renewable energy, it will go a long way in helping a lot of progress in the country. So we'll have to think of a lot of out-of-the-box solutions like that. About the aspect of ancient wisdom which was raised by one of the participants here. Well, yes, I was mentioning it as an example, and we will have to think along those lines, but in a different landscape now which exists today as compared to what exists earlier, but use that same creative genius which brought forth all that wisdom about our interstellar orbits and the equations and the theorems for orbiting around the Earth much before any other scientists could evolve those. So that sort of genius will again have to come into play in this area also of climate change. Thank you.
I think we have just time for one last question, and that's it. I'm sorry.
Thank you. Neil Desai, teaching Gandhian philosophy at the University of Virginia. And I think we've talked about power to alternative energy, lots of big industrial type issues that are very important to solving this problem. But I'm interested to get your take on how this issue affects the lower income segments of society, specifically from two perspectives. One, India is very unique in that the masses are very aware of how this issue is affecting them. Surveys consistently show that majorities of the Indian population would actually be willing to give up some economic growth to have a better environment. And Ambassador Kapoor talked a lot about the deep cultural precedents for that. So with this strong sentiment in favor of environmental sustainability, how is the government incorporating that? Is it ignoring it? If it's incorporating it, how, to what extent? Other perspective, how is this segment being served by the existing policies? Historically, one of the biggest contributors to greenhouse gases in India was not coal or cars or power plants or anything like that, but wood burning, people burning wood for fuel, for cooking, etc. I think someone mentioned that the air pollution in India cuts 3 years off every person's life, right? And it's the lower income segments of society that are most affected by that. So how are there policies to address that? So those two perspectives.
I know we're out of time, so I'll keep this very short. So I completely agree with you that I think what we need to think about is the lower income perspectives from the view you said. I'll add one more to it, that these are the groups that are going to be the first time users of energy in the next decade or 2 decades. So one kind of, I think, low-hanging fruit is to try to think about how, as people in some sense move up the energy ladder, move away from, let's say, open wood fire to using gas or start having electricity, how do you move them to getting the most energy efficient appliances? So I think one thing that there is a lot of scope for is to start thinking about energy efficiency appliances in a way that's no longer possible in a lot of the richer world where systems are already set up. So you're not setting up transmission lines. As you said, power plants, once they're done, have 30-year life. So I think the big opportunity is to recognize that these are people who are going to get connected to the grid for the first time. And you can work with them precisely because they have the preferences you stated to try to make smarter choices. I think everyone would agree that they need electricity, they need energy, but you can get them in sort of smarter, more efficient ways, and I think that hopefully is something the government would take up.
Well, you said a lot of what I had to say, and the rest was said by Rohini, so I have nothing more to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much.